My name's Eli, and if I'd known what I was getting myself into, I never would have camped at Crescent Ridge. I'd driven my RV out to the edge of the ridge hoping for a weekend of solitude. Crescent Ridge was isolated, tucked away from the main roads, surrounded by dense woods and quiet trails, the perfect escape from city noise. The first night was peaceful, the silence only broken by the occasional crackle of the campfire and the gentle rustling of leaves. I relaxed in my RV, enjoying the stillness, my only company the stars above. But as I settled into sleep, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound echoing through the night, like footsteps in the distance. It was slow, deliberate, each step reverberating through the quiet. I figured it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, wandering around nearby. I shrugged it off, convinced I was alone out here, and eventually drifted off to sleep. The next morning I hiked along the ridge, enjoying the quiet and taking in the views. The silence was comforting, but there was an odd feeling hanging over the place, a tension I couldn't quite shake. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I was just unused to being so completely alone. As evening fell, I returned to the RV, making dinner and settling in for another quiet night. But as soon as darkness blanketed the ridge, the sound returned, closer this time, the rhythm clearer. It wasn't the irregular movement of an animal. It was too measured, too intentional. Sitting inside the RV, I strained to listen, my heart racing. The footsteps grew louder, each one echoing through the silence, coming from somewhere just beyond the clearing. I felt a chill creep up my spine, an instinctual fear that something wasn't right. I stepped outside, shining my flashlight into the trees, but there was nothing, only the empty darkness and the echo of the sound, fading into silence. I told myself it was nothing, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me, and went back inside, locking the door behind me. But as I lay in bed, the sound returned, even closer. The footsteps now circling the RV, slow and steady, each one filling the small space with an unnatural rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps moved around the RV, stopping just outside the window. My pulse quickened, and I crept to the window, peeking out into the darkness, but there was nothing there, only the shadows cast by the trees and the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the branches. The footsteps faded, leaving an eerie silence that made my skin prickle. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every creak and rustle sending my heart racing. By morning, I was exhausted, but I convinced myself it had to be an animal, maybe a larger one wandering close to the RV. But the tension lingered, a nagging feeling that something was watching me. That night the sound returned, louder and closer, the footsteps now right outside the RV, pacing back and forth. I sat in the dark holding my breath, feeling trapped, the small space suddenly suffocating. I tried to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't there, but the footsteps grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was out there was waiting for me to acknowledge it. I mustered up the courage to call out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped, leaving a thick silence that pressed down on me. For a moment I thought it was over, that whatever it was had finally gone. But then I heard it. A faint tap against the RV door, slow and deliberate, like someone knocking. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to stay silent, to ignore it. But the knocking continued, soft yet insistent, filling the air with an unnatural rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. I gripped my flashlight, taking a deep breath as I opened the door a crack, my heart pounding. Outside, the clearing was empty, the silence thick and oppressive, the forest shrouded in shadows. I stepped out, shining my light around, but there was no one there. Only the faint echoes of footsteps, fading into the trees. I backed away, retreating to the RV, locking the door behind me. The next morning I decided it was time to leave. I packed up quickly, eager to put distance between me and whatever was haunting Crescent Ridge. But as I started the RV, I felt an odd compulsion to look back, a pull that made my stomach twist. In the rearview mirror I saw it, A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, tall and shadowed, its form barely visible in the morning light. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unyielding, fixed on me. My heart pounded as I sped down the road, the figure fading into the distance, the weight of its presence lingering in the RV like a shadow. Even now, miles from Crescent Ridge, I can still hear it. The faint, rhythmic thump, like footsteps echoing through the night, filling the RV with an unnatural tension. Sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I hear it again. The slow, steady rhythm that haunted my nights at Crescent Ridge. And each time, I feel its gaze. A reminder of the figure that watched, waiting for the moment I would finally notice it. And I wonder if, somehow, it's still following me, lingering in the shadows, its presence etched into the silence, waiting for me to return to Crescent Ridge. My name's Alex, and I've always loved a good campfire tale, especially the ones that leave you glancing over your shoulder. That's why I jumped at the chance to camp at Blackwater Falls, known for its ghost stories and eerie legends. I went with my friends, Leah, Chris, and Tom, all seasoned campers who laughed off the stories as just myths to scare tourists. But none of us were laughing after that night. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon, setting up near the waterfall's edge where the sound of rushing water filled the air. The trees around Blackwater Falls were dense, their branches twisting together in dark, tangled shapes. As dusk fell, a mist crept over the ground, swirling in strange patterns, making everything look surreal. Around the fire, we traded stories, mostly trying to outdo each other with the scariest legends we'd heard. Eventually, the conversation turned to the legend of the Phantom Camp. According to locals, every now and then, a camp would appear near the falls, complete with a fire and tents, looking as if someone had just stepped away. But if anyone got too close, they'd realize the camp wasn't as empty as it seemed. Some say the original campers had vanished, leaving only shadows that still lingered, trapped in a loop of whatever terrible fate had befallen them. Leah rolled her eyes as Chris recounted the story. "So, a ghost campsite?" "Please," she scoffed. "I'll believe it when I see it." "Be careful what you wish for," I joked, trying to keep the mood light. But deep down, I felt a prickle of unease. Something about the mist, the dark shapes of the trees. It felt like the forest was hiding something, watching us. We sat around the fire for a while, laughing and joking, but as the night wore on, a strange silence settled over the campsite. Even the waterfall seemed quieter, as if muffled by an unseen hand. Tom, who'd wandered off to collect more firewood, came back with a strange look on his face. "Guys, there's another camp down by the falls," he whispered, his voice tense. We exchanged uneasy glances. We hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, and the campsite had been empty when we arrived. Curiosity got the better of us, and we grabbed our flashlights, following Tom through the trees toward the water's edge. As we approached, I saw it. A small campsite set up in a clearing by the falls, complete with a flickering fire and 2 tents, the orange glow casting eerie shadows on the mist-covered ground. But there was something off. The flames were too still, barely moving as if frozen in time, and the tents looked old, their fabric faded and torn. "Maybe it's abandoned," Leah whispered, though her voice shook. But the camp didn't look abandoned. It looked paused, like someone had just left and could return at any moment. A chill ran down my spine, and I turned to the others, but they were all staring at the camp, mesmerized. "Let's go check it out," Chris said, already moving forward. "Are you insane?" I hissed, grabbing his arm. "What if the stories are true?" He just laughed, shaking me off. "Come on, Alex. It's just an empty campsite." Reluctantly, I followed, keeping close to Leah as we moved toward the tents. The air was colder here, the mist thicker, wrapping around us like a damp, suffocating blanket. I shone my flashlight on the tents, the beam revealing the worn, tattered fabric, the zippered entrance slightly open as if inviting us inside. "Look," Leah whispered, pointing to a set of footprints in the dirt, leading from the tents to the water's edge. The prints looked fresh, too fresh, as if they'd been made moments before we arrived. A sense of dread settled over me, but Chris was already crouching by the fire, reaching out to touch one of the logs. "It's warm," he murmured, his voice filled with disbelief. "But how?" We all stared at each other, the reality sinking in. This was no abandoned camp. It was as if we'd stumbled into a place that shouldn't exist, a piece of time trapped and replaying itself over and over. Just then, the mist thickened, swirling around us, and I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadowy figure standing just beyond the edge of the firelight, watching us. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Leah nodded, her face pale. "We need to leave, now." But as we turned to go, a soft voice echoed through the mist, faint and distant, like it was coming from the other side of a thick wall. "Help. Us." I froze, my heart pounding, the voice sending chills down my spine. It sounded desperate, pleading, and I felt a strange urge to turn back, to find whoever had called out. But then, another voice joined the first, then another, until the air was filled with a chorus of whispers, all blending together in a haunting, unintelligible chant. The mist thickened, obscuring our surroundings, and the camp seemed to fade, the tents and fire flickering like a mirage. "Run!" Tom shouted, breaking the spell, and we stumbled back through the trees, our flashlights barely piercing the fog as we sprinted toward our campsite. But no matter how far we ran, the whispers followed, growing louder, more frantic, filling my mind with fragments of words, pleading, warning, begging. When we finally reached our own camp, I dared to look back, expecting to see the phantom camp disappearing in the distance. But to my horror, it was closer than before. The tents and fire somehow shifted to just beyond our campsite, as if it had followed us. "We have to get out of here," I gasped, grabbing Leah's arm. "Get to the RV." We scrambled inside, slamming the door, and watched through the window as the phantom camp faded in and out of view, flickering like a broken film. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on us, suffocating. But just as I thought we were safe, I saw them. Figures standing outside the tents, shadowy shapes barely visible through the fog, watching us with hollow eyes. They were still unmoving, but their presence felt heavy, ancient, as if they'd been waiting for someone to find them. One of the figures raised a hand pointing at the RV, and I felt a chill run through me, a cold that seeped into my bones. It was as if they were marking us, claiming us as part of their endless, haunted vigil. "Drive," I whispered to Tom, barely able to speak. "Get us out of here!" He didn't hesitate, starting the engine and tearing down the narrow dirt road, the phantom camp shrinking in the rearview mirror. But even as we left it behind, I could feel the weight of those eyes, watching, waiting, as if they'd follow us, no matter how far we went. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away from Blackwater Falls, the mist and trees finally replaced by the familiar shapes of town. But even now I can still see it in my mind. The ghostly camp, the flickering fire, and those empty, unblinking eyes. And sometimes late at night I hear it, the faint echo of voices, calling, reminding me that Blackwater Falls isn't done with us yet. My name's Mia, and ever since I was young, I've felt a pull toward places with history, places that seem to hold secrets. That's how I ended up at Gray Hollow, an RV park tucked away in a quiet valley surrounded by dense pine forests. The locals avoided it, calling the woods around it the Whispering Pines, but I couldn't resist the allure. I'd always been drawn to the eerie and unexplained, convinced there was something magical about places like this. The first evening I set up my RV at the edge of the forest, excited for a weekend of hiking and solitude. As I walked around the site, a strange sound caught my ear, a soft, rhythmic whisper, like the wind moving through the trees, but with a strange, almost melodic cadence. I paused, straining to listen, The sound was faint, almost indiscernible, but it didn't feel random. It was like a voice, just out of reach, weaving through the trees in a steady, repetitive rhythm. Intrigued, I stepped closer to the edge of the woods, the cool evening air prickling my skin. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and I realized with a shiver that they weren't just the wind. They were words, soft and breathy, spoken in a language I couldn't understand. But there was something inviting about them, a gentle pull that made me want to step into the forest, to follow the sound. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me, and I packed a small bag, deciding to venture into the woods. The locals' warnings echoed in my mind, but I brushed them off as superstitions. I was too intrigued to turn back now. The forest was dense, the pines towering overhead, their twisted branches casting strange shadows on the ground. As I walked, the whispers grew louder, their cadence rhythmic, almost like a chant. I couldn't make out the words, but they felt familiar, as if they'd been waiting for me. I walked for what felt like hours, the trees pressing in on all sides, the forest growing darker as I ventured deeper. The whispers were everywhere now, surrounding me, guiding me along a narrow, winding path. Every so often I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a flash of movement, a shadow darting between the trees. But whenever I turned, there was nothing there, only the empty forest. My footsteps slowed as I reached a small clearing, the ground covered in soft moss. At the center was an ancient, twisted pine tree, its roots gnarled and exposed, weaving across the ground like veins. The whispers seemed to converge here, filling the air with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I took a cautious step forward, my gaze drawn to something at the base of the tree. A small, weathered box, half buried in the dirt. The whispers grew louder, urging me to pick it up, to open it. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the box. Part of me wanted to turn back, to leave this strange place, but the pull was too strong, the whispers too insistent. I brushed away the dirt, lifting the box carefully, my fingers trembling. The box creaked as I opened it, revealing a small folded piece of paper. The words inside were faded, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Once you hear them, they never stop. Run before they follow you. A chill ran down my spine, and I dropped the box, my heart pounding. I looked around, suddenly aware of the silence. The whispers had stopped, leaving an oppressive stillness that seemed to press down on me, heavy and suffocating. I turned to leave, but as I took a step back, the whispers started again, louder this time, echoing through the trees in an urgent, frantic rhythm. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were calling my name. Mia. Mia. My breath caught, and I broke into a run, my footsteps echoing in the quiet as I stumbled through the forest, desperate to escape. But no matter how fast I ran, the voices followed, surrounding me, growing louder with every step. The trees seemed to twist and shift, the path narrowing, guiding me deeper into the forest. I tried to turn back, but the path was gone, replaced by a dense wall of pines that blocked my way. The whispers grew louder, filling my mind, drowning out my thoughts. They were relentless, calling my name over and over, each word sinking into my bones, urging me to keep going, to follow them. Finally, I burst into another clearing, gasping for breath, my heart racing. But as I looked around, my stomach dropped. It was the same clearing, the same twisted pine tree at its center, the box lying open at its roots. No, I whispered, backing away, my voice shaking. I'd been running in circles, trapped in some nightmarish loop that I couldn't escape. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the trees, filling the air with a suffocating, inescapable presence. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw them. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, standing between the trees watching me. They were tall, their forms stretched and twisted, their faces obscured by the shadows. But I could feel their eyes on me, a cold, invasive gaze that made my skin crawl. They moved closer, stepping out of the shadows, their faces blank, hollow, as if they were only half-formed, caught between worlds. The whispers grew louder, and I realized with a sickening dread that the voices were coming from them, their mouths moving in unison as they chanted my name. Mia. Mia. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, but they kept advancing, their steps slow and deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world. I turned, searching for an escape, but the trees closed in, trapping me, the path disappearing into darkness. Desperate, I backed against the twisted pine, the whispers filling my mind, my vision blurring as the figures closed in, their hollow eyes fixed on me. Then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, everything went silent. The figures stopped, their eyes locked on me, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, one of them spoke. "Run!" I didn't wait to understand. I bolted, tearing through the trees, my heart pounding as the whisper started again, louder, more desperate. I could feel the figures behind me, their presence like a shadow that clung to me, following my every step. I stumbled through the forest, my lungs burning, my mind racing, until finally, I broke through the trees, the edge of the RV park just ahead. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door behind me, the silence a shocking contrast to the chaos of the forest. The whispers stopped, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing. I stayed up all night, my eyes fixed on the trees, waiting, half expecting to see those figures standing at the edge, watching, waiting. I left Gray Hollow the next morning, too shaken to stay another night. But even now I can still hear them sometimes, soft, persistent whispers that echo in the back of my mind, calling my name, guiding me, reminding me that the forest is still waiting. And I know that one day, I'll find myself back at Gray Hollow, following the whispers once more, drawn by a force I can't resist. My name's Liz, and one of my favorite parts of camping is unplugging, but not completely. I like having the comfort of my phone nearby, knowing I can still reach someone if I need to. That's why I picked the RV site at Deep Pines. It was remote enough to feel like an escape, but close enough to the edge of the forest to get a few bars of cell service just in case. On my first night, everything went as planned. I set up my RV, cooked a small meal, and settled into a book as the sun dipped below the horizon. But just as it got dark, I noticed something strange. My phone lost its signal completely. I tried moving around, holding it higher, even restarting it, but nothing worked. I figured it was just a fluke, that maybe the service cut out at night for some reason. A little unnerving, sure, but I decided to roll with it. The next morning, my phone was back to normal. Full bars, notifications pinging, everything fine. It was odd, but I shrugged it off, figuring I'd get used to it. But each night, as the sun sank below the trees, the signal vanished like clockwork. By the third night, it was starting to feel deliberate. That night, as I settled in, a new notification pinged just before the signal dropped, a message from an unknown number. It simply said, "Don't look outside." I stared at the message, my heart racing. It had to be a prank. Maybe someone I knew was messing with me, knowing I'd be out here alone. But just as I was about to respond, the signal vanished, leaving me staring at the screen in silence. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I felt a sudden urge to check the windows, but the message echoed in my mind. Don't look outside. It felt like a dare, one I wasn't sure I was ready to take. I sat in silence for what felt like hours, every creak of the RV making my pulse quicken. Finally, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. I settled into bed, hoping to shake off the unease and get some sleep. Around midnight, my phone pinged again. My heart leapt as I grabbed it, surprised to see I had service. Another message from the same unknown number. "He's close now. Don't move." My hands shook as I read it, the words sinking in like a cold knife. I wanted to look around, to check if someone was outside, but a part of me was too afraid to move. I tried to ignore it, to brush it off as some twisted prank, but the silence around me felt thick, pressing down on me. And then, my phone pinged once more. This time, it was a photo. It was a grainy, low-light image, but I could clearly make out my RV framed by the dark outline of the trees. The picture was taken from somewhere in the woods, close enough that I could see my silhouette through the window. My stomach twisted, dread pooling in my gut. Someone was out there watching me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen, trapped by the fear that whoever had taken the photo was still out there, still watching. Another message came through. Don't let him know you saw. I forced myself to stay still, barely breathing as I read the words. Every instinct screamed at me to turn off the lights, to hide, but the messages seemed to warn against it. I stayed rooted in place, praying the person outside would lose interest, that this was just some sick prank. Minutes passed in silence, each second stretching longer than the last. Finally, my phone went dark, the signal gone once more. I was left alone in the darkness, my own heartbeat the only sound I could hear. I didn't sleep that night, every noise outside the RV keeping me on edge. By dawn, I felt half-crazed, exhausted, and terrified. The minute my phone regained signal, I checked it, hoping for answers, but there was nothing. No new messages, no trace of the photos. It was as if they'd never been sent. I debated leaving, but I convinced myself that maybe it had all been some elaborate prank, that I was overreacting. The daytime brought a sense of normalcy, the forest around me peaceful and quiet. I decided to stay one more night, hoping the incident wouldn't repeat. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the signal dropped again, as expected. I sat in silence, my nerves on edge, waiting for something to happen. And then, just as before, my phone lit up with a new message. Don't turn around. I felt a chill race down my spine, every muscle tensing as I read the words. I was alone in the RV, or at least I thought I was. But the message made me doubt, made me feel like something was right behind me, close enough to reach out, and another message came through, a single word. Hide. I didn't hesitate this time. I turned off the lights, crouching down, heart hammering as I huddled in the darkness. I could barely breathe, every sound amplified, every shadow a threat. I forced myself to stay still, resisting the urge to look around, to see if anyone or anything was inside with me. And then, in the silence, I heard it. A soft scratching, like nails dragging along the outside of the RV. The sound moved slowly, scraping along the metal, circling me, taunting me. My phone lit up with one final message. He's here. I covered my mouth, stifling a scream as the scratching grew louder, more frantic, like something was trying to claw its way inside. I stayed frozen, every nerve on fire, my mind racing with images of what could be out there. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive, but I didn't dare move. I waited, listening, heart pounding, until dawn's first light filtered through the window. When the sun rose, I bolted outside, looking around for any sign of whoever or whatever had been there. The ground was undisturbed, no footprints, no marks, nothing to indicate that anyone had been near the RV. It was as if it had all been a dream, a nightmare that left no trace. But when I checked my phone, the messages were still there. The photos, the warnings, each one etched into my memory. I didn't waste any time packing up, my mind reeling as I drove away from deep pines, vowing never to return. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me, that it's still watching, waiting. Sometimes late at night, my phone will light up with a notification, a message from an unknown number, and every time I wonder if it's him, waiting for the moment I finally turn around. My name's Jenna, and I always thought I had a great memory. That's why I laughed off the stories about the forgotten path. According to the locals around Willow Creek Campground, there was an unmarked trail that, if followed, would erase any memory of what happened there. I'd heard it from the camp host who chuckled as he told the story, saying that people often found themselves lost, only to return with no recollection of where they'd been. When my best friend Rachel and I came across an unmarked trailhead during our hike, I joked that it must be the forgotten path. Rachel raised an eyebrow, grinning, daring me to go in. So we did. The first few steps felt normal enough, the forest quiet and calm. But as we walked deeper, an odd feeling settled over me, like a thick, invisible fog clouding my mind. The trees seemed closer, the light dimmer, casting long shadows that danced on the ground. "You feel that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, trying to shake off the uneasy sensation. Probably just the thrill of doing something we're not supposed to. But it was more than that. The deeper we went, the stranger everything felt. I'd look at the ground and see my own footprints beside me, as if I'd walked this trail before. And every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of something out of place. A piece of fabric snagged on a branch, a broken branch lying across the path. Things that made me feel like we weren't the first ones here, or like we were somehow looping over our own steps. "Jenna, look," Rachel said, pointing to a tree up ahead. Carved into the bark were the words, "Remember who you are." The letters were jagged, etched deep, as if someone had carved them in a hurry. Beneath the words was a small, folded piece of paper, wedged into the bark. I pulled it out, unfolding it carefully. It was a note, written in shaky handwriting. "If you find this, turn back before you forget." A chill ran through me, and I handed it to Rachel, her face mirroring the unease building inside me. "Someone's messing with us," she said, though her voice wavered. We continued down the path, trying to brush off the feeling, but every few minutes we'd find another note, each one more unsettling than the last. "Don't trust the trees," one read. Another said, "You've been here before." After an hour, or maybe two, I started to feel disoriented. It was as if the forest itself was shifting, leading us in circles. I'd glance at my watch, but the time didn't make sense. It felt like minutes had passed, but hours were gone, as if time was slipping away. "Jenna, do you remember how we got here?" Rachel asked, her voice strained. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words didn't come. I realized, with a growing sense of dread, that I couldn't remember where the path had started. I couldn't remember which direction we'd come from, or even why we'd ventured down this way in the first place. Another note appeared, this time lying in the center of the path. "The path takes what it wants." A knot formed in my stomach. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Rachel nodded, her face pale, and we turned to retrace our steps. But as we walked, the path seemed different. Trees that had been familiar now loomed strangely, twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like fingers. Every so often, I'd see our footprints crossing each other in the dirt, a maddening reminder that we'd been here before but couldn't remember. "Did you put that there?" Rachel asked suddenly, pointing to a note pinned to a branch. I shook my head, my heart pounding as I read it. "They're watching you now." I glanced around, my eyes scanning the shadows between the trees, half expecting to see something, someone, lurking there. The forest felt alive, as if it were breathing, watching, waiting for us to make a wrong move. "Jenna, what if we're stuck here?" Rachel's voice was small, filled with a fear that echoed in my own heart. "No," I said, more to myself than to her. "We just need to keep walking. We'll find the way out." But as we moved, the notes continued to appear, scattered on the ground, pinned to trees hidden under rocks. Each one seemed to know exactly what we were thinking, what we feared. "It won't let you remember. Time doesn't work here. Who are you?" With every note, my sense of self felt weaker, my memories slipping like sand through my fingers. I could barely remember where I was, let alone why we'd come. And then, as I reached down to pick up another note, my breath caught in my throat. The handwriting was mine. It was my own shaky script, scrawled in black ink, the words blurring before my eyes. Don't trust her. I looked up, my heart pounding as I glanced at Rachel. She was staring at me, her face pale, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I couldn't remember who she was, or why I was here with her. A strange fear gripped me, as if I were staring at a stranger. "Jenna?" she asked, her voice soft, uncertain. "Are you okay?" I forced myself to nod, swallowing down the fear. "I'm fine," I whispered, but even as I spoke, the words felt hollow, distant, like they belonged to someone else. Another note appeared at my feet. "You can't leave." We stumbled forward, our steps quickening, desperation clawing at us as we tried to escape. But the forest only grew darker, the trees closer, the path narrowing until it felt like we were being swallowed whole. And then, in the dim light, I saw it. A clearing up ahead, a break in the trees. Relief surged through me, and I grabbed Rachel's hand, pulling her toward it. But just as we reached the edge, I froze, a sense of horror washing over me. The clearing wasn't an exit. It was where we'd started. Our campsite lay just beyond, our RV parked in the same spot, untouched. But as I looked around, something felt wrong. The air was too still, the light too dim, as if we'd stepped into a mirror of the real world. Rachel and I stared at each other, the same realization dawning on both of us. We had returned, but we hadn't left. We were still on the path, trapped in some twisted version of reality, a place that looked familiar but felt wrong in every possible way. I reached into my pocket, finding a crumpled piece of paper. Unfolding it, I read the words written in my own hand, though I had no memory of writing them. "The path remembers, but it won't let you." As we stood there, the world around us shifted, the trees closing in, the sky darkening, as if the forest itself was sealing us in, erasing every trace of us, every memory of what had happened. I don't know how long we've been here, or if we'll ever leave. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I remember fragments, a trail, a friend, a warning I didn't heed. And every now and then I find another note, one that I don't remember writing, a message from myself, reminding me of who I was. But the memories fade quickly, slipping away, leaving only the echo of my own words. The path takes what it wants. My name's Tom, and I'm the kind of guy who loves ghost stories. When my friends suggested we camp out at Raven Hill, a place known for its eerie lights that appear on the hills at night, I was all in. We took my RV to the site, figuring we'd have a safe base close to the action. Raven Hill was remote, surrounded by dense woods, and felt like a place where strange things could easily happen. The first night was quiet, and after setting up a small campfire outside, we sat around, swapping ghost stories and daring each other to explore the hilltop. The night was calm, the air crisp and clear, with only the occasional hoot of an owl breaking the silence. We laughed about the stories we'd heard, saying they were just meant to scare off tourists. But as midnight crept closer, the lights appeared. At first, they were faint, hovering at the top of a distant hill, glowing a soft, ghostly blue. There was something strange about their movement, too steady, too deliberate to be flashlights or any kind of natural light. They drifted along the ridge, moving in slow, eerie patterns, as if they were following an invisible path. "Look," I whispered, nudging my friend Leah, who was sitting beside me. "Do you think it's other campers?" She squinted, her face serious. "I don't know. It doesn't look like flashlights." Our friend Chris, always the skeptic, scoffed. "It's probably some locals messing around, or a trick of the light." But as we watched, the lights continued to move in perfect unison, weaving in and out of the trees, their glow casting faint shadows on the hill. We fell silent, the laughter gone, replaced by an uneasy curiosity. "Let's check it out," Leah said, her voice barely a whisper. I hesitated, feeling a strange reluctance, but curiosity got the better of me. We grabbed our flashlights, leaving the RV and heading up the narrow trail toward the hilltop. As we walked, the lights seemed to stay just ahead, as if leading us along the path. The silence was intense, every step echoing through the trees, the only sound our shallow breaths. The trail led us up a steep incline, and by the time we reached the top, the lights had vanished, leaving us in near darkness. I scanned the area, my flashlight casting long shadows, but the hilltop was empty, just an open clearing surrounded by trees. "Where did they go?" Chris asked, shining his flashlight around. Just then, the lights reappeared on the opposite hill, flickering faintly, almost as if they were watching us from a distance. The silence was oppressive, and a chill ran through me, a feeling that we weren't alone. "Let's go back to the RV," I murmured, feeling a growing sense of unease. As we made our way back down, the lights began to follow, trailing us, always at the edge of our vision. Every time we stopped to look, they stopped too, hovering just beyond the trees, their glow casting eerie shadows that stretched across the ground. When we finally reached the RV, we scrambled inside, locking the door behind us. My heart pounded as I peered out the window, expecting to see the lights outside, but the hilltop was empty, the lights gone as suddenly as they had appeared. We laughed nervously, trying to shake off the tension, but an uneasy silence settled over us. No one mentioned the lights, as if saying it out loud would somehow make it worse. The next night, the lights returned, appearing closer, hovering just outside the RV. They moved slowly, drifting around the perimeter, their glow casting faint shadows that flickered against the windows. Leah gasped, her eyes wide as she stared at the lights, her face pale in the dim glow. "Do you think they're watching us?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Chris shook his head, though his expression betrayed his fear. "It's just lights. They can't do anything." But as we watched, the lights moved in closer, hovering right outside the windows, casting an eerie blue glow that seeped into the RV, filling the small space with a strange, oppressive energy. It felt as if the lights were probing, searching for something, their presence heavy, almost sentient. The next morning I wanted to leave, but curiosity and a strange compulsion kept me there. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, that the lights were some natural phenomenon. But deep down, I knew there was something off about Raven Hill, something that defied explanation. That night, the lights returned for the third time, but this time, they were right outside the RV, their glow so intense it felt like daylight. The air grew colder, and a faint, rhythmic sound echoed around us, like a distant heartbeat, pulsing in time with the lights. Leah grabbed my arm, her face pale. "They're closer. They're trying to get inside." A chill ran through me as I watched the lights move around the RV, circling us, their glow pressing against the windows, casting strange shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls. The heartbeat-like sound grew louder, filling the air, vibrating through the floor of the RV. Suddenly, the lights blinked out, plunging us into darkness. The silence was so complete it felt suffocating, pressing down on us, filling the small space with an oppressive weight. I held my breath, straining to listen, but there was nothing. Only the heavy silence and the pounding of my heart. Just as I started to relax, a soft glow appeared outside the window, and there, in the distance, I saw them. The lights, hovering at the edge of the clearing, their glow faint but steady, as if watching, waiting. "We need to leave," I whispered, a sense of urgency filling me. "Now." We scrambled to pack up, and as we started the RV, the lights moved closer, their glow brightening, casting eerie shadows across the ground. I hit the gas, speeding down the narrow road, glancing back in the rearview mirror. The lights followed, hovering just at the edge of the trees, their glow flickering like distant stars. They seemed to pulse, matching the rhythm of my heartbeat, a quiet, insistent reminder that we weren't alone. Even now, miles from Raven Hill, I can't shake the memory of those lights. Sometimes late at night, I catch a glimpse of a faint blue glow outside my window, a reminder of the lights that watched, the spirits that lingered on Raven Hill. And every time I feel their presence, a quiet, haunting call urging me to return, urging me. My name's Mia, and I'd been looking forward to a quiet weekend at Shadow Lake for months. The campsite was isolated, perched by the shore of a serene, glassy lake, surrounded by thick woods. It was exactly the kind of peace I needed after months of city noise and chaos. On my first day, as I was setting up camp, I noticed something strange lying by a tree at the edge of the lake. A tall antique mirror, its frame ornate and tarnished with age. It looked out of place, too elegant to be left in the woods, as if someone had abandoned it there on purpose. Curious, I examined it. The glass was clear, uncracked, and it cast my reflection in perfect detail, though something about it felt off. It was as if my reflection was looking back at me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. But I brushed it off as a trick of the light, deciding to bring the mirror back to my RV. That night, as I settled in, the mirror stood in the corner, leaning against the wall, casting faint reflections in the dim light. I glanced at it a few times, but nothing seemed unusual. I convinced myself that any strangeness was just my overactive imagination. But as I was getting ready for bed, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror. My reflection was standing there, still and silent, but its eyes were different, sharper, as if it were watching me, observing every move. I laughed it off, telling myself I was being ridiculous, but a small part of me felt unsettled. As I lay in bed, the mirror loomed in the corner, its surface catching the faint moonlight. I tried to ignore it, eventually drifting off to sleep. The next morning, I noticed something odd. My hair, usually tied back, was loose, spilling over my shoulders. I distinctly remembered tying it up before bed, but maybe I'd just forgotten. Shrugging it off, I went about my day, hiking around the lake, exploring the forest trails, letting the strange memory fade. But that night, as I was brushing my hair, I glanced at the mirror again. My reflection was brushing her hair too, mirroring my movements, but with a slight delay, as if she were hesitating, observing before reacting. I froze, watching as the reflection's hand stilled, her eyes locked on mine. "Hello?" I whispered, feeling foolish. The reflection didn't respond, only tilted her head, her eyes flickering with a hint of something dark, something I couldn't name. I backed away, my heart pounding, and turned off the light, climbing into bed with my back to the mirror. In the darkness, I felt the weight of its gaze, as if my reflection were watching, waiting. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was letting a simple mirror get under my skin. But over the next few days, the reflection's behavior grew stranger. It was subtle at first. Small delays, movements that didn't quite match mine, lingering stares that seemed too intense. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as nerves, but each night it felt more real, as if my reflection was alive, acting on its own. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I looked at the mirror again. My reflection was there, standing still, her eyes fixed on mine. This time, she didn't move as I did. She just stared, a faint smile curving her lips, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. A shiver ran through me, and I reached out to cover the mirror with a blanket, desperate to block out the reflection. But as I reached forward, my reflection's hand moved, meeting mine at the surface of the glass. I yanked my hand back, heart pounding, but the reflection didn't retreat. She stayed there, her hand pressed against the glass, her eyes locking onto mine with a strange, hungry intensity. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The reflection tilted her head, the smile widening, and mouthed something, her lips moving silently. I couldn't hear her, but I knew, deep down, that she was answering, that she was trying to tell me something. I backed away, grabbing the blanket and throwing it over the mirror, blocking her out. But that night, as I lay in bed, I felt her presence, as if she were still there, watching me from behind the blanket. The next morning, I decided to get rid of the mirror. I dragged it back to the lake's edge, leaning it against the tree where I'd found it, hoping that whatever haunted it would stay behind. But as I turned to leave, I felt a strange compulsion to look back, to see if the reflection was still there. My heart sank. She was there, standing in the mirror, her hand pressed against the glass, her eyes fixed on mine with an expression of longing, as if she were waiting for something. She mouthed something again, her lips forming silent words, words I couldn't understand but felt echoing in my mind. I stumbled back, turning away, but as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left a part of myself behind, trapped within the mirror's frame. That night, I felt an unsettling emptiness, a hollow feeling that gnawed at me, as if something essential was missing. And then, in the middle of the night, I heard it, a faint knock at the door of my RV. I froze, my mind racing. No one should have been out there. I was alone, miles from anyone, but the knocking continued, slow and steady, each tap resonating with an unnatural rhythm. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door a crack, my heart pounding as I peered outside. The campsite was empty, the night silent. But something caught my eye by the tree where I'd left the mirror. It was a shadow, faint but unmistakable, standing by the lake, watching. I slammed the door shut, backing away, my mind reeling as the knocking resumed, louder this time, echoing through the RV like a heartbeat. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the sound filled my mind, drowning out every thought. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. I sat in silence, my pulse racing, but as I looked around, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The mirror was gone. I'd left it behind, but somehow I could feel it, its presence lingering, as if it had never truly left. I packed up and left Shadow Lake the next morning, driving without looking back, desperate to escape whatever haunted that mirror. But even now I can't shake the feeling that my reflection is still out there, watching, waiting. Sometimes when I catch my reflection in a mirror, I see something. A flicker of movement that doesn't quite match, a shadow that lingers a little too long, a smile that isn't my own. And every now and then, when the room is quiet and the lights are low, I hear it. The faint tapping of a hand against glass, a reminder that part of me is still there, trapped within the mirror at Shadow Lake.